On a cold November morning in 1796, a courier rode hard toward the Italian front. His message, sealed with imperial wax, was for General Napoleon Bonaparte. It contained a single, direct order from the French government. Abandon your offensive and return to Paris. Victory was within his grasp, the Austrian army reeling. To obey meant to lose everything he had won. Napoleon read the dispatch, then made a choice. He chose to ignore it. This was not simple disobedience, it was a fundamental break. For centuries, military power had served the state. The general was an instrument of the monarch's will. Napoleon inverted that equation. He decided the state would now serve his military ambition. The campaign in Italy would continue under his command, not theirs. His subsequent victories would make him a hero, a consul, and finally an emperor. But the seed of his ultimate ruin was planted in that moment of defiance. The decision created a template of personal rule divorced from national interest. It forged an army loyal first to its commander, not its country. This model of glory-seeking would drive his campaigns for the next 2 decades. It led to triumphs at Austerlitz and Jena. And it would inevitably lead to the frozen wastes of Russia, and the final, lonely defeat at Waterloo. One refusal to stand down began the unraveling of an empire before it was even built. The grand expedition began with sails of hope. Athens, supreme at sea, sent its greatest fleet across the Ionian Sea. The goal was the rich, grain-producing island of Sicily. The target was its most powerful city, Syracuse. It was a bold strike meant to cripple Sparta by cutting off its food. But Athens had sent its armada nearly 1,000 miles from home. The city of Syracuse was not some weak outpost. It was a formidable power in its own right, protected by massive limestone walls and defended by a large population. The Athenian generals Nicias and Alcibiades were divided in purpose from the start. Then a desperate plea for help from Syracuse reached Athens's eternal enemy. Sparta decided to send a commander. His name was Gylippus. Gylippus did not bring a large army, he brought something more dangerous: expertise. He reorganized the Syracusan defenses, teaching them how to counter Athenian naval tactics. The great Athenian fleet, trapped in the city's wide harbor, found its advantage neutralized. Their ships became crowded, unable to maneuver. The Syracusans adapted their own vessels, reinforcing the bows for direct ramming attacks in the confined space. The campaign stretched from one season into the next, a costly stalemate draining Athenian treasure and lives. Back in Athens, the assembly refused to recall the expedition. Instead, they sent more ships, more men, deeper into the trap. The commitment was total. There would be no graceful retreat. The fate of an empire now hinged on a siege, far from home, that was already failing. The disaster that befell Athens was born of ambition. But the catastrophe at Balaclava was born of a single, simple phrase. On a misty October morning in 1854, the British and French armies faced Russian forces along a series of ridges in the Crimea. The British held the high ground. A series of misdirected infantry attacks had left Russian cannon batteries exposed in a long valley below. Lord Raglan, the British commander observing from the heights, saw an opportunity. He sent an order to the Light Cavalry Brigade, commanded by Lord Lucan, to advance and prevent the enemy from removing those guns. The written order was vague. It stated the cavalry should attack the enemy and try to prevent the carrying away of the artillery. From his position in the valley, Lucan could not see the specific guns Raglan meant. He asked the aide who delivered the order, Captain Louis Nolin, for clarification. Nolin, an impetuous cavalryman, gestured not toward the vulnerable guns on the flank, but angrily down the length of the main valley. "There, my lord, is your enemy, there are your guns," he is said to have shouted. It was a fatal gesture. Before Lucan stood a valley over a mile long, framed on 3 sides by Russian infantry and artillery. To obey what he believed was a direct order, Lucan turned to his brother-in-law, Lord Cardigan, and commanded the Light Brigade to charge. 673 men drew their sabers. Cardigan, knowing the order was suicidal, did not question it. He simply straightened his jacket, raised his sword, and gave the command to walk. Then trot, then charge directly into the mouth of the Russian guns. The disaster in the Crimea was a tragedy of misheard words. But the next great mistake was written down, in precise ink, years before the first shot was fired. It was a plan so rigid, it became a trap. In Berlin, Count Alfred von Schlieffen spent decades perfecting a single solution. Germany feared a war on two fronts, against France in the west and Russia in the east. His answer was a breathtaking gamble. He would send almost the entire German army in a giant arc through neutral Belgium. It would sweep around Paris like a door slamming shut, crushing the French army against its own frontier in just 6 weeks. Only then would Germany turn east to face the slower-moving Russians. Every train schedule, every supply depot, every march was calculated to the hour. The plan was a masterpiece of military clockwork. But a plan is not reality. By 1914, the new Chief of Staff, Helmuth von Moltke, felt the blueprint was too ambitious. He weakened the right wing of the invasion, the very hammer blow meant to decide the war. He also left forces to defend Alsace, a move Schlieffen had scorned. When the order came in August, the million-man machine lurched into motion. It demanded Belgium's immediate surrender, but the Belgians refused and fought. Their resistance bought precious days. British troops, honoring an old promise, crossed the Channel faster than Berlin thought possible. The German advance became a slog, not a sprint. The exhausted German soldiers pushed to within sight of Paris, their boots coated in the dust of a 300-mile march. At the River Marne, French reinforcements arrived from the capital in taxicabs. The German lines stretched thin, a gap opened between two armies. Seeing the opportunity, the French and British struck. The German command, communicating by wireless and motorcycle couriers, could not react with the speed the crisis demanded. The order came to retreat. The flawless 6-week timetable was shattered. The war of movement was over. What remained was the trench, the mud, and 4 years of deadlock. The plan designed to avoid a long war had guaranteed one. The rigid failure of the Schlieffen Plan had locked nations into a war of attrition. 2 decades later, another German plan would gamble everything on speed. This time, the scale was almost unimaginable. On June 22, 1941, 3 million German soldiers crossed into the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa was the largest invasion force in history. Hitler's war machine rolled east across a front stretching nearly 2,000 miles. The initial advance was terrifyingly fast. Whole Soviet armies were encircled and captured. By autumn, German units were within sight of Moscow's spires. But the plan contained a fatal flaw. It assumed the Soviet state would collapse like a rotten door from a single mighty kick. German logistics were designed for a short campaign, expecting victory before winter. Troops advanced in summer uniforms. Their vehicles were not prepared for the mud. And they profoundly underestimated the Soviet capacity to resist. Then the Russian weather arrived. Autumn rains turned roads into bottomless bogs. The relentless German advance slowed to a crawl. When the ground froze, a bitter cold followed, colder than any in living memory. German engines refused to start. Frostbite crippled divisions. Soviet reinforcements, drawn from the vast interior, began to counterattack. The Wehrmacht had been stretched to its limit. The single kick had not shattered the door. Instead, it found itself stuck on the threshold, exposed in a frozen land, facing an enemy that was only growing stronger. The gamble for quick victory had become a war of survival. The invasion of Russia had broken the German army in the snow. Yet, as 1941 drew to a close, another catastrophic calculation was being finalized across the world. In Tokyo, the Imperial Japanese Navy planned a strike of shocking precision. Its target was the U.S. Pacific Fleet, anchored at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The goal was simple: deliver a single crippling blow to American naval power in the Pacific. Japan's admirals believed this would buy them the time and space to secure their new empire. They saw the United States as a distant, soft nation that would seek a negotiated peace after a decisive defeat. On the morning of December 7th, their tactical execution was nearly flawless. Torpedo bombers skimmed the water, dive bombers screamed from the sky. Within 2 hours, 8 battleships were sunk or damaged. Over 2,000 American servicemen were killed. The attack was a masterpiece of military surprise. And it was a complete strategic disaster. The plan fundamentally misjudged the American character. Rather than shattering morale, the attack unified a divided nation with a single furious purpose. The sleeping industrial giant Japan feared was now fully awake and enraged. Crucially, the fleet's aircraft carriers, the true center of naval power, were not in port that day. The Pacific War would be decided by these ships, and they remained untouched. Japan had won a battle, but in doing so, it had guaranteed its own defeat. It had awakened an enemy with limitless resources and a demand for total victory. The previous miscalculation unfolded across oceans. This one would be televised. By 1968, the Vietnam War had settled into a grim, weary stalemate. American commanders spoke of a light at the end of the tunnel. The enemy, they believed, was nearly broken. In the cities of South Vietnam, a tense quiet prevailed during the Lunar New Year ceasefire known as Tet. Then, in the early hours of January 30th, that quiet shattered. Explosions and gunfire erupted not in distant jungles, but in the heart of Saigon itself. Viet Cong commandos blasted their way into the U.S. Embassy compound. Simultaneously, over 100 South Vietnamese cities and towns came under coordinated assault. The ancient imperial capital of Hue was captured. It was a scale of attack previously thought impossible. Militarily, it was a disaster for the communist forces. They held no major objectives for more than a few days. Their losses were catastrophic. The Viet Cong as a fighting force was virtually annihilated. In pure tactical terms, it was a clear American and South Vietnamese victory. But the images told a different story. They showed fighting inside the U.S. Embassy walls. They showed a South Vietnamese general executing a Viet Cong prisoner on a Saigon street. They showed the brutal house-by-house battle to recapture Hue. The offensive proved the enemy could strike anywhere at any time. The official narrative of inevitable progress crumbled under the weight of those pictures. A war supposedly being won suddenly looked endless and unwinnable. The political shockwave in Washington was immediate and profound. Public support for the conflict evaporated. It was December 1979. Soviet leadership believed it faced a brief surgical operation. A friendly government in Kabul was crumbling. The Politburo's objective was simple: secure the capital, install a loyal leader, and withdraw within months. It was to be a contained show of force. Instead, it became a decade-long wound. The Soviet military, built for vast European tank battles, now entered of stone and sand. They rolled into cities with heavy armor, but the real war existed in the mountain passes and remote villages. Here, the Mujahideen resistance moved with the land. They used ancient caravan routes, supplied with modern weapons from foreign intelligence agencies. Soviet convoys became targets on narrow roads. Helicopters like the Mi-24 Hind hunted guerrillas who vanished into the hills. A war of attrition set in. The initial swift victory never came. Instead, a grinding stalemate consumed young conscripts. Morale plummeted as casualties mounted with little visible gain. Back home, the state-controlled media called it a mission of international duty, but the returning soldiers told a different story. They spoke of a conflict with no front lines, against an enemy they could not see, for a cause that grew more hollow each year. The financial drain was relentless. Billions of rubles were funneled into a conflict that produced only more resistance. This economic bleed coincided with growing internal stagnation. The war, meant to project strength, instead exposed a profound weakness. It revealed a system unable to adapt, to understand its adversary, or to admit a mistake. The quagmire in Afghanistan became a slow leak, draining the legitimacy and resources of a superpower. The collapse would not happen on a battlefield overseas, but from within. The Soviet Union had collapsed under the weight of its own imperial overreach. A decade later, a new power prepared to act, convinced it had learned the lessons of history. In the autumn of 2002, the case for war against Iraq was presented not as a gamble, but as a certainty. The central premise was clear and terrifying. Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction and the intent to use them. This intelligence was treated not as a collection of hypotheses, but as irrefutable fact. A single phrase, "We don't want the smoking gun to be a mushroom cloud," crystallized the perceived danger into a national imperative. The decision to invade was framed as an act of preemption, a necessary strike to disarm a lethal threat before it could materialize. Yet the intelligence was profoundly flawed. It was a mosaic built from shaky sources. Claims about mobile biological weapons labs came from a single, dubious informant codenamed Curveball. Reports of attempted uranium purchases from Niger were based on crude forgeries. The existing UN inspection regime, which had dismantled Iraq's earlier programs, was dismissed. The data was filtered through a political mindset already fixed on regime change. Certainty replaced caution. When coalition forces swept into Baghdad in April 2003, they found no stockpiles of chemical or biological weapons. No active nuclear program. The core justification for the war simply evaporated. The aftermath was not peace but a vortex. The swift military victory gave way to a protracted insurgency. The disbanding of the Iraqi army created a pool of armed, resentful men. Sectarian tensions, long suppressed by Hussein's regime, erupted into civil war. The conflict would last nearly 9 years, cost thousands of lives, and destabilize an entire region. The real weapons of mass destruction proved to be the consequences of the decision itself, a conflict launched on faulty assumptions, whose reverberations would define global politics for decades. The dust of these battlefields settled long ago, yet the ground still shifts underfoot. The decisions made in those moments did not end with the final casualty report or the signing of a treaty. They traveled forward through time like shockwaves through stone. The failure of a single plan locked nations into a war of trenches, which bred a war of ideologies, which redrew the map of the entire world. A miscalculation on a Pacific island ensured the sunrise of an atomic age, casting a permanent shadow over all diplomacy that followed. An invasion into the mountains of Central Asia unraveled the seams of a superpower, releasing forces its architects never intended to. These are not isolated errors, confined to their chapters in a history book. They are causal links in a chain. The charge of a few hundred cavalrymen echoed in the rigid planning of a world war. The overreach of an ancient democracy mirrored in the quagmires of modern ones. The same fatal ingredients reappear: hubris, flawed intelligence. The terrible disconnect between a plan on paper and the chaotic reality of the field. History is not merely a record of what happened. It is the ongoing conversation between a decision and its infinite consequences. The bridge collapses and the river forever changes its course. The empire falls and the world must live in the space it left behind. Today, strategists still study the maps of these catastrophes, not to refight old wars, but to recognize the same patterns as they begin to form. The echo is a warning. It is the sound of the past asking a question of the future.